Hey folks, welcome to Animal Attacks. Today, I'll be going over some entitled Karens who decided to get way too close with deadly animals. From a Karen who pushed past her guide and came face to face with a grizzly, to another one who decided to go look for a leopard herself, thinking she could befriend it, ending in the most brutal way imaginable. It was May 17th, 2014. And the late autumn sun hung low over a private game reserve in South Africa's Limpopo province. The reserve allowed visitors to navigate dirt roads through Big Five territory in their own vehicles. Rules were posted at every gate, printed on maps, and repeated verbally by staff. Windows closed, doors locked. No visitor may exit their vehicle in predator zones. Margriet van Houten was a 45-year-old interior design blogger from Charleston, South Carolina, traveling with her husband, Peter, 48, a software consultant of South African descent who had grown up in the country but had not visited in over 15 years. The trip was Margriet's initiative, planned around content for her design and travel platforms. She had told friends she intended to capture photographs that would distinguish her feed from competing accounts. The couple entered the reserve at approximately 7 a.m. The gate ranger reviewed rules verbally and handed them a laminated safety card. He noted a pride of lions had been sighted near a waterhole along the eastern loop. After 90 minutes, they reached the waterhole area. Several vehicles had gathered, photographing through closed windows. The lions were visible but distant, resting in tall dry grass, roughly 100 yards from the road. Margriet was dissatisfied with the distance. She radioed the gate ranger, asking about closer access. He reminded her to remain in the vehicle. She insisted she had seen closer photographs from this reserve. The ranger repeated that no exceptions existed. Over the next 30 minutes, most vehicles moved on. One lioness had separated from the pride and settled into dry grass approximately 30 yards from the road, nearly invisible against the landscape. Margriet opened her door. Peter grabbed her arm and pointed at the safety card. She pulled free and told him she would only be a second. She exited, walking toward what she believed was an empty clearing. Two remaining vehicles began honking. A driver in a nearby SUV shouted for her to get back in. She waved them off and continued, camera raised toward the distant pride. African lions are among the continent's most formidable predators, with adult females weighing between 265 and 395 pounds, and capable of explosive acceleration from rest. Lionesses are ambush specialists, whose tawny coloring renders them virtually invisible in dry grassland. They attack with speed and precision, closing short distances in seconds. Lions are responsible for a number of fatal attacks annually in some regions of Africa, with incidents concentrated where human proximity triggers reactive defensive behavior. The lioness had been resting less than 30 yards from where Margriet stood, aware of the vehicles for hours, but tolerating them as non-threatening. A human on foot was a different equation. According to the reserve's incident reconstruction, based on dashcam footage from a nearby vehicle, the lioness launched from the grass without any obvious warning that an untrained eye could have detected. No growl, no visible shift in posture. The attack covered the distance in just a few seconds. The impact struck Margriet from a direction she was not facing, targeting her upper body and neck. She was on the ground before the sound of her camera hitting the dirt reached the nearest vehicle. Peter started forward before stopping as others shouted at him to stay back. The honking intensified. The lioness hesitated, standing over Margriet for several seconds before the sustained noise from multiple vehicles finally drove her back into the grass. The attack had lasted seconds. Reserve rangers reached the scene within several minutes. Margriet van Houten had suffered catastrophic injuries to her neck and upper body, leading to rapid death. She was pronounced dead before medical personnel arrived. Investigation confirmed she had exited in a marked predator zone against verbal, written, and posted warnings. The reserve was cleared of liability. The lioness was not destroyed, her behavior classified as a normal reactive response. The incident was logged with the Provincial Conservation Authority, and the area was temporarily closed for review. It was May 11th. 2016 in Hohenwald, Tennessee. The morning tour at the Managed Elephant Facility was moving through its scheduled stations, small groups following guides along marked pathways. The rules were posted at every stop and repeated at the entrance. It advised visitors to stay behind the barriers and avoid unsupervised contact. Deborah Kane, 58, was a retired travel agent who had spent 30 years booking wildlife tours for other people and had decided she knew more about animals than most guides half her age. Friends described her as opinionated and confident, someone who rarely accepted correction and almost never admitted she was wrong. She had a particular interest in elephants, referencing documentaries and travel programs throughout the morning as evidence of her familiarity with the animals. From the moment the tour began, she positioned herself not as a visitor following instructions, but as someone assessing whether the instructions were worth following. This is the part that gets me. She'd spent 30 years booking these tours. She knew the rules, just didn't think they applied to her. At the first stop, she tried to feed one of the elephants outside the scheduled feeding window. The guide corrected her. Deborah told him the animal was clearly expecting food and that withholding it was unnecessary. The guide moved on. At the second stop, she reached out to touch an elephant during a no-contact segment. The guide corrected her again. She told him the rule made no sense, given how calm the animal appeared. At the third stop, she crossed a rope boundary to get a closer photograph and had to be escorted back. She responded loudly, asking why the rules existed at all if the animals were accustomed to people. At some point during the tour, she told the guide, a 26-year-old handler with 3 years of hands-on experience, that her knowledge of elephant behavior from documentaries was extensive. The guide said nothing and kept the group moving. 26 years old with 3 years of hands-on experience, and she told him his documentary knowledge was not as good as hers. I genuinely had to put my notes down for a second when I read that. The final station was a controlled feeding area. Visitors stood behind a reinforced steel barrier fitted with a narrow feeding slot that limited how far a hand could extend. The elephant at this station was Rosie, a 47-year-old female who had been at the facility for 9 years. Staff described her as stable and accustomed to visitors, but highly food-motivated and sensitive to sudden contact near her face. Elephants have highly developed spatial memory and strong food-motivated behavior. An animal accustomed to a feeding routine will track and anticipate contact near its face and react sharply to anything that disrupts that expectation. The guide explained the rules before the group approached. Stay behind the barrier. Keep hands flat. Do not reach past the designated point. And this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable. Deborah joined the group at the barrier and followed the instructions for about 30 seconds. Then, she decided to take a photograph. The angle was not right from behind the slot. She stepped to the side of the designated feeding slot, where the barrier curvature created a slightly wider gap, and leaned past the intended limit, reaching out to touch Rosie's face to hold her still for the shot. Rosie pulled back sharply, her head swinging and her trunk moving in a rapid reactive motion. Deborah lost her balance forward, dropping at the base of the barrier with her upper body angled into the reach zone through the gap. Rosie reacted instantly, slamming her forefoot down onto Deborah's upper body and pinning her against the ground with crushing force. The compression was immediate and severe, fracturing multiple ribs and causing catastrophic internal injury to her chest cavity. The guide reacted within seconds. The area was cleared and emergency services were called. Deborah Kane was pronounced dead at the scene. She was 58 years old. Investigators discovered repeated violations led to unauthorized contact, triggering elephants' forceful reactive behavior, causing fatal injuries. The hardest part is that the guide documented everything, every correction, violation, and warning. It's all in the report, and none of it stopped what happened at the final station. It was August 14th, 2017, on the southwestern fringe of the Serengeti. For Selena Merrow, the day began with an argument about camp rules and a sun that hadn't yet finished setting. She had no idea that the real cost was still days away. Selena Merrow had built a small following by reviewing restaurants across Southeast Asia and coastal Australia through short, contemptuous videos on YouTube. A travel outlet had commissioned her for a piece on safari camp food, the gap between what operators advertised and what actually arrived on the plate. She had called the pitch Safari Theater. She flew into Arusha on August 11th and reached the camp by land on the 13th. By the evening of her first full day, it looked like the Karen in her was already coming in hot. She had argued twice with the camp manager, once about dinner service timing, once about the prohibition on personal food inside tents. She considered the policy performative. That night she brought 3 protein bars, dried mango, and a sealed container of mixed nuts into her tent. In a message sent to a friend at 6:42 p.m., she described it as a small act of protest. Staff had repositioned and relatched all food storage bins that afternoon. 2 separate guests had reported lion tracks in the dry watercourse before sunset. Lions are not common immediately adjacent to tented camps in this corridor, but they are not unknown. A male lion averages 400 pounds, a female 280. Their canine teeth apply over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. They can tear through heavy canvas with a single claw hook. The camp also sat along a known game trail used by migrating wildebeest and zebra during dry periods, which occasionally brought predators closer to human structures after dark. The senior guide, Festus, who had worked that corridor for 9 years, conducted a walkthrough of the tent row at roughly 5:15 p.m. and spoke to at least 2 guests about keeping tent flaps fully sealed and zipped. He did not speak to Selena. Her tent light was on when he passed, but he was immediately shooed away when she heard him walking closer. Footage from a camp exterior camera showed a single female lion entering the camp perimeter from the dry watercourse side at 6:51 p.m. Her movement was slow and cautious, stopping multiple times to look toward nearby tents and listen. She moved low, shoulders rolling, head extended, and was nearly silent. Investigators later believed the lion had likely been following scent trails from improperly discarded cooking scraps near the staff preparation area earlier that evening, and Selena's occupied tent was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lion lingered around the outer edge of camp for several minutes before approaching Selena's tent. The first contact is audible before it is visible, a heavy inhalation, then the sudden rip of canvas as a claw hooked through the tent wall just above Selena's sleeping pad. She shouted twice, sharp and rising. She opened the inner flap outward, and immediately the lion's head filled the opening. What followed is partially captured on 2 separate recordings and took under 2 minutes. Selena was pulled forward, her shoulder wedging against the tent frame. The lion appeared startled once Selena began screaming, but continued swiping and biting during the confusion at the tent entrance. She was bitten a minimum of 4 times, the right forearm, the left hand, a deep raking bite across her ribs. But the 5th bite, a sustained clamp to the lateral neck, severed her right carotid artery. Other guests began throwing boots, water bottles, and a folding camp chair. Festus arrived with a flare gun at approximately the 90-second mark and discharged it twice skyward. The lion flinched, but did not immediately release. The lion dragged her another 3 feet before the second flare caused it to back away. Selena remained on the ground. Medical staff arrived 25 minutes later and found no vital signs. Her funeral was a sparse affair in her hometown of Perth, attended by a few bewildered relatives. Selena's death wasn't a tragedy of wilderness. It was a tragedy of performance, where the real lion wasn't the one with teeth, but the one she'd been trying to starve in herself all along. It was March 14th, 2016. The bush camp sat at the edge of a private game reserve in southern Africa, a loose collection of open-air structures built low into the scrubland, with no fences and no walls between the guests and the bush. Renelle Couch was 44 years old. She was an office manager from Phoenix, Arizona, and she had been saving for this trip for almost 2 years. It was a 7-day, fully guided small group safari, the kind of program where you are out in the open with the animals and nothing separating you from them. It sounds incredible, and for most people, it is. Renelle's issue was pretty simple. She thought she knew better than everyone around her, always. By day 2, she'd already complained about the meal schedule before the first full day was even over. She told staff the wake-up times were unreasonable. She got into a direct argument with one of the junior guides about the after-dark perimeter rule, framing it as a matter of common sense rather than safety, like the rule was an insult to her intelligence rather than a condition she had agreed to in writing. A leopard had been using the area around camp as part of his range for about 3 years. Wild, adult male, completely unmanaged. He moved through the perimeter at night and treated the camp like just another part of his territory. He had grown used to humans through exposure alone, not because anyone had worked with him or tamed him. That is a very different thing from safe. Staff were clear about that distinction. So was the paperwork every guest signed before arrival. On the afternoon of March 14th, the male was spotted resting near a storage structure on the eastern side of camp. 2 staff members went out to assess. Totally routine. They kept their distance, around 50 feet out, and observed him from a position downwind. He raised his head, looked in their direction, and settled back down. They watched him for a few minutes and returned to the main area. Ronell watched the whole thing from the common area, and that was enough for her. At dinner, she was telling other guests the staff were being overdramatic, that the leopard was clearly chill around people, that she'd watched the staff get close and nothing happened. One of the other guests pushed back. She brushed it off, said she trusted her own eyes. Every night, without fail, guests were reminded to stay inside the main lodge after 8 p.m. The perimeter path was off limits after dark. Every guest signed off on this before they even booked. At 9:20 p.m., Ronell left her room. She had clocked the Eastern Staff access gate earlier that day. Simple latch, not locked. With everyone else inside, she walked straight to it, lifted the bar, and stepped out into the dark with her camera and a keychain flashlight. Camp lighting carried maybe 15 feet past the perimeter. After that, it was just bush. The leopard had moved from the storage structure into low scrub about 30 feet northeast of the gate, sometime after dark. Ronell made it roughly 18 feet before he was on her. He came from behind, out of the scrub, covering the distance in under 2 seconds. The bite landed on the back of her neck and drove her straight down into the dirt. She never made a sound. Nobody knew she was missing until 10:45 p.m. when a routine interior check came up empty. Staff swept the perimeter and found the eastern gate unlatched and slightly open. They found her at 10:58 p.m., 18 feet out. The leopard was gone. Her keychain flashlight was still on in the dirt a few feet from her body. A response team reached the camp around 1:15 a.m. There was nothing to be done by then. Whatever she thought she was going to see out there, it was not worth this. Nobody wins an argument with a leopard in the dark. The post-mortem found a single bite to the back of the neck. It severed her spinal cord, and she would have been unconscious within seconds. It was over in under 3 minutes. The gate showed no signs of being forced. She opened it herself. The leopard was monitored in the weeks after, but never destroyed. The case was ruled accidental death. A wild animal responding to a stranger entering his space after dark. No staff member was found at fault. It was March 3rd, 2017, and the sun had just risen over Thabakaya Wildlife Reserve in Limpopo Province of South Africa. Dry acacia scrub stretched across the landscape, the golden grass still heavy with morning stillness. A safari vehicle had paused on a raised overlook where guests were watching wildlife movement in the distance. Greta Folson, 61, had worked in Scottsdale real estate for more than 2 decades. Recently retired into part-time consulting, she had spent a year preparing for the safari, studying wildlife documentaries and reading travel material despite having no prior field experience. She often described her domestic cats as a kind of small-scale wild animal, a comparison others occasionally challenged. She was traveling with a small group of American tourists, guided by Sifo Ndlovu, a licensed reserve guide. The morning drive had begun before sunrise with clear instructions. Remain seated at all times, keep limbs inside the vehicle, and do not approach or exit under any circumstances. The surrounding terrain was open but visually deceptive, with low brush that allowed predators to move undetected at close range. The rules are simple, but the environment doesn't make them feel urgent. African lions are ambush predators that rely on concealment and short bursts of high-speed acceleration rather than sustained pursuit. Earlier in the morning, the group had observed a pride moving through a dry riverbed at a distance. Greta commented that they appeared calm and not interested in people, despite being reminded that distance and visibility can be misleading in open savanna terrain. Later, the vehicle stopped at a second viewing point along a low embankment bordered by a wooden safety fence. From this position, a subadult lion was visible farther out in the brush. Sifo scanned the surrounding area, as is standard procedure in open terrain stops. Greta stepped onto the vehicle's running board and then climbed over the low boundary fence onto the embankment edge despite being instructed to remain inside the vehicle. She stated she wanted a clearer photograph and believed the animal's distance made it safe. Within seconds, a lioness emerged from the grass approximately 11 meters to her left. She was already in a low stalking posture, partially concealed by vegetation. Sifo shouted for everyone to get down and remain inside the vehicle. The lioness accelerated immediately. Covering the short distance in a few seconds, she closed in a direct line toward Greta. The impact struck her at upper torso level, knocking her off the embankment and down a short slope. She landed on her back, momentarily separated from the animal. The lioness quickly recovered and attacked again, biting the back of Greta's neck and upper shoulder. The bite caused a high cervical spinal cord injury, resulting in immediate paralysis and rapid loss of consciousness, followed shortly by respiratory arrest. Inside the vehicle, things broke into chaos fast. People were shouting, some freezing up, and one passenger tried to open the door before Sifo and the tracker physically pulled them back and told them to stay put. Sifo took a controlled shot into the air using a reserve-issued rifle under emergency protocol. It wasn't aimed at the animal, just enough to break the situation and force space. The lioness backed off a short distance, but didn't leave. She stayed there, watching, like she was deciding whether to continue or not. Even when it pauses, it doesn't feel like it's gone. After that, there wasn't much anyone could safely do. Everyone was stuck in place, inside the vehicle, because stepping out or firing again risked making things worse in such close, open terrain. They had to wait for backup while keeping everyone contained. By the time reserve response teams finally arrived, there was nothing left to reverse. Greta had already died at the scene. The medical assessment later confirmed a high spinal injury that shut down breathing almost immediately, leaving no real chance for medical intervention, given how fast it happened and how far they were from proper emergency care. The official investigation concluded that the incident occurred after Greta exited the designated safety zone in violation of guide instructions. The safari operator's internal review found that standard protocols were followed by staff and that the encounter resulted from a sudden ambush by a wild predator in close-range terrain. The lioness was not euthanized, as authorities classified the behavior as natural predation response following human proximity intrusion rather than abnormal aggression. Following the incident, the reserve reinforced boundary markings at viewing stops and updated visitor briefing procedures to emphasize that even short-range exits from vehicles in open terrain can trigger immediate predatory response. Greta's family requested privacy, and the incident was recorded as a rare but recognized human-predator encounter resulting from a breakdown of safety boundaries in a wild, uncontrolled environment. It was March 14th, 2015. A small private reptile and wildlife facility sat on the outskirts of a rural town in northern Queensland, Australia. Handwritten signs on the roadside, a wooden booth at the entrance, gravel paths connecting a handful of open-air enclosures. The air was thick and humid, wet season just winding down, everything smelling like standing water and raw feed. Pamela Storch was 44, a property manager from Brisbane who had driven up with two coworkers for a long weekend. The facility wasn't even part of the plan. She spotted a flyer at their motel and insisted they stop in. 5 minutes in, she was already arguing with the guide. She told him the enclosure layouts didn't match what she'd seen described online and asked whether the animals were actually wild or just bred in captivity. At one point, she turned to the group and said the guide clearly had no idea what he was talking about and that she'd read more about this facility than he probably had. By the halfway point, she'd moved on to complaining that the animals weren't active enough. The tour was too slow. The whole thing felt like false advertising, and she was going to say so in her review. When the guide asked everyone to stay back from the monitor lizard enclosure, Pamela walked straight up to the mesh, pressed her fingers against it, and told her coworker that warning signs at these places meant nothing. So here's some context on what they were actually dealing with. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile on the planet. Adult males can reach 17 feet and push well past 1,000 pounds. And that stillness everyone always mistakes for laziness, that's not the animal being inactive. That's a predator on a hair trigger. When they move, they are already on you before you've registered it. There is no warning. By the time the group reached the holding area, they'd been walking about 30 minutes. It was a secondary pen used to separate animals during feeding rotations. Concrete floor, chain link fencing, a single gate with a sliding bolt latch, and a handwritten staff-only sign on it. The guide had flagged it at the very start of the tour. Don't touch the gate. Stay on the gravel path. The crocodile inside was a large adult male lying completely still near the far end of the enclosure, tucked into the shadow along the back wall. Pamela stared at him for a moment, then said the sign was probably just there for legal reasons, and that these facilities put warning signs on everything to avoid getting sued. Then she walked up to the gate. She pulled the bolt open, pushed it back, then opened it again, with her eyes on the crocodile the whole time, waiting for some kind of reaction. When it didn't move, she took that as confirmation and opened the gate a third time, wider, leaning her weight forward against it. I genuinely have no idea what she thought that crocodile was going to do. Just sit there forever? What happened next took under 2 seconds. The crocodile launched from the far wall, and the distance between them was gone before anyone could do anything about it. It hit Pamela at the lower left leg, and she went straight down. The death roll started before she finished hitting the ground. One hard rotation, and what followed was something nobody in that group was prepared to see. Staff reached the area within minutes, drove the animal back with a handling pole, and secured the gate. Emergency services were contacted immediately by radio. The facility sat 34 miles from the nearest trauma-capable medical center on roads that don't move fast. Response time was just over 40 minutes. Pamela Storch was pronounced dead at the scene. The post-mortem confirmed complete degloving of the lower left leg and full severance of the femoral artery at the upper thigh. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock, with time of death estimated at 4 to 6 minutes after the initial strike. The bolt latch came back fully functional, manually operated, Pamela's fingerprints on it. Witness accounts from 3 members of the tour group confirmed she had opened and closed that gate multiple times before the attack. The case was ruled accidental. The holding area was permanently closed to visitor access, and no charges were filed. It was August 14th, 2014, on the Victoria Nile inside Murchison Falls National Park, Uganda, where the river flattens into wide channels between shifting sandbar shelves, and the afternoon had gone quiet, in the way the guides knew better than the tourists ever would. Elise Hartman was 36, a freelance regulatory consultant from Hamburg who had built a professional identity around identifying institutional failures. She traveled frequently, documented everything, and had a reputation among colleagues for pushing back against authority when she believed protocol was being applied arbitrarily. She had booked a 5-day safari through a licensed Kampala-based operator, the Nile stretch being the second day. Her stated goal, mentioned to at least 2 other passengers the night before at the lodge, was specifically to witness the crocodile behavior in the wild, not in a sanctuary. The Nile crocodile, adults regularly reaching up to 16 feet and exceeding 2,000 pounds in large dominant specimens, does not chase. It holds still in shallow water near exposed shoreline, often fully submerged except for the eyes, and waits for something to enter the strike zone. And of course, you already know their signature death roll. That August was peak nesting season, and females had been confirmed within 200 meters of the primary boat channel for 2 consecutive weeks prior. The guide had received a radio advisory that morning warning all river operators to avoid unscheduled passenger disembarkation along the central sandbar corridor due to confirmed nesting activity. He relayed this to the group at departure. At approximately 2:20 p.m., Elise began complaining of nausea and cramps, demanding the boat stop so she could stand on solid ground. The guide declined, citing the advisory directly, and maintained a strict no disembarkation safety posture in line with park protocol. She escalated. She accused the guide of fabricating the restriction to cut the excursion short. The argument lasted approximately 9 minutes. At 2:31 p.m., Elise stepped off the bow onto the sandbar unassisted while the guide was repositioning and a second crew member was at the rear engine. She landed in approximately 4 inches of water at the bar's edge. She had been standing there no more than a few seconds, roughly 6 to 8 seconds by witness estimation. The crocodile came from her left, out of water that appeared no deeper than her ankles. There was no warning sound. Witnesses described the initial movement as a white spray and a single heavy impact. The animal's jaws closed across her left thigh and lower hip. The force of the strike knocked her sideways and partially into the deeper channel adjacent to the bar. For approximately a brief moment lasting only a few seconds, she remained visible above the waterline, upper body twisted, one arm extended toward the surface. Then the crocodile rolled. A death roll in shallow water generates enough rotational force to cause catastrophic injury. This time, she went under. The guide immediately throttled the engine, shouted warnings, and radioed river patrol while maneuvering the vessel away from the sandbar edge. The animal did not resurface in that location. The river absorbed visibility rapidly, with strong current and sediment disturbance reducing surface clarity within seconds of the initial strike. A patrol vessel and wildlife unit arrived on site at approximately 30 minutes after contact. Full remains were not recovered. Death ruled accidental, with notation of victim-initiated departure from vessel against direct operator instruction during an active wildlife advisory. Authorities updated river access enforcement protocols within 60 days. No public statement was issued. What makes this case genuinely hard to process isn't that the risk wasn't communicated. It was communicated clearly, professionally, and more than once. Elise made a calculation that her own judgment outweighed the guide's, stepped onto that sandbar to prove a point, and the river settled it in under 10 seconds. It was July 18th, 2015. The tour ran out of a small coastal outfitter on the Gulf side of Florida, running half-day snorkel trips to a shallow reef about 2 miles offshore. The water averaged between 8 and 14 feet deep, and the fish density at the site was high enough to regularly attract larger predatory species. Brenda Ford was 43 years old. She was a fitness instructor from Tampa, Florida, and had taken this specific tour twice before. She made sure everyone on the boat knew that before they left the dock. She had strong opinions about how coastal guides handled shark sightings, specifically that pulling a group out of the water was a liability decision rather than a safety one, and she shared those opinions with the group during the pre-departure briefing without being asked. It was the kind of thing you say when you want the people around you to know you are not like them. Bull sharks are one of the most dangerous coastal shark species in the world. They are common in shallow, warm water environments, including the same reef systems used for recreational snorkeling. Adult bull sharks average between 7 and 11 feet in length and between 200 and 500 pounds. They are aggressive, highly territorial in shallow water, and are responsible for a significant number of unprovoked attacks on humans globally. A bull shark making slow investigative passes through a group of swimmers is reason enough to end the session. Whether it attacks or not is beside the point. The guide's job is not to wait and find out. The group entered the water at around 10:15 a.m. 6 guests and the guide. Conditions were good, light current, visibility around 25 feet. The first 40 minutes were uneventful. At around 10:58 a.m., the guide spotted a bull shark moving along the outer edge of the reef at about 10 feet down, heading toward the group. The animal was roughly 8 feet long and kept circling back toward the swimmers. The guide signaled an immediate water exit. 5 of the 6 guests started moving toward the boat. Brenda surfaced, looked at the boat, looked back toward the shark, and told the group out loud that the guide was overreacting. Then she went back under. The guide surfaced and called to her. She came up briefly, said the shark was nowhere near her, and that she was not cutting her session short over nothing, and went back down. The guide instructed the boat operator to reposition toward her and tracked her from the surface. She had moved away from the reef into open water in the direction the shark had last been traveling. The guide could see her from the surface, hovering at mid-depth, facing outward. The shark came from below and to her left. A single fast strike to the upper left thigh, angled upward. It hit, released, and moved off. Brenda was knocked upward and broke the surface hard. The guide reached her within seconds of her surfacing. The wound was immediately serious. The bite had opened the left thigh deeply enough to reach the major vessels. Blood loss in open water was fast. The guide applied direct pressure with both hands and called the boat in. It reached them in about 90 seconds. Getting Brenda onto the deck took another minute. The boat operator pushed the throttle toward shore while the guide held pressure on the wound. The nearest shore access was about 12 minutes away at full speed. She lost consciousness around 4 minutes into the return. Emergency services were already waiting at the dock based on the radio call made during transit. Brenda Ford was pronounced dead at the dock. The femoral artery in her left thigh had been severed. That artery carries blood at high pressure, and once it is cut, the body loses blood faster than anyone on a moving boat can stop. By the time they reached the dock, the window for any kind of intervention had already closed. The boat's radio log documented the exit signal, the emergency call, and the return time. The 5 guests who had complied with the evacuation signal all gave consistent accounts of the briefing and the events on the water. The death was recorded as accidental. The circumstances that led to it were not. It was February 27th, 2018, at the Daintree River in Queensland, Australia. In the pre-dawn light, dense rainforest canopy filtered what little visibility there was, leaving the riverbank in muted gray tones. The water moved slowly through mangroves and mudflats, where the boundary between land and river was uneven and partially obscured by roots and sediment. Norva Stelp, 49, worked in logistics administration in Brisbane. Recently divorced, she was traveling alone along the Queensland coast, documenting her trip through photography and a private blog shared with a small group. She had limited experience with wildlife environments, but was confident in her own judgment and often relied on personal interpretation when observing animals. She arrived early at a public river access point along the Daintree system before any guided tours were present. The area was marked with warning signage advising caution due to crocodile activity, especially near the waterline and mud banks where visibility was limited. The saltwater crocodile is an apex ambush predator capable of remaining almost completely still for extended periods before striking with extreme speed over short distances. In the early morning, individuals may rest near the surface or along mud banks, sometimes with minimal visible movement, which can make them appear inactive despite being fully alert. At the river's edge, Norva observed a large male crocodile lying partially on a mud bank with its body aligned toward the water. Its mouth was slightly open in a thermoregulatory posture. She stopped to take photographs and moved closer to the waterline for a lower angle shot, despite a nearby visitor, Jerome Katz, calling out warnings and advising her to move back. Jerome kept telling her to step back, saying the crocodile could hit from close range without any warning at all, but she stayed where she was, still aiming her camera, trying to get the shot from just a few meters off the water. The animal didn't move at all, just lying there, so calm that it almost felt harmless, even though something about it didn't quite sit right in the background. Without warning, the crocodile initiated a rapid ambush. It surged forward from the mud bank in a short, explosive burst, closing the distance in seconds. The attack was direct and immediate, with no prolonged display or hesitation. The first bite struck Norva's left thigh with extreme force, causing catastrophic soft tissue destruction and likely severe vascular injury. The impact caused immediate collapse, and she was pulled off balance into the mud and shallow water. The crocodile maintained its grip and dragged her fully into the river in a continuous motion. After that point, everything just shifts into the water with her. Nothing stays on land anymore. Once in the water, the animal submerged with her, disappearing beneath the surface. As is typical for saltwater crocodile behavior, the crocodile likely repositioned its prey underwater in deeper sections or near submerged structures where visibility was limited and currents were stronger. The primary injury left Norva incapacitated almost immediately due to a combination of severe trauma and blood loss. Once submerged, she was unable to surface effectively, and drowning followed as the secondary and final mechanism of death. Jerome Katz immediately called emergency services and provided a detailed report within minutes. Search and rescue teams were dispatched quickly, but response time was extended due to difficult terrain, limited river access points, and low visibility conditions on the water. River-based units arrived roughly 35 minutes later and began coordinated searches of the area. Operations were complicated by strong current flow, submerged roots, and shifting debris along the riverbed, all of which reduced underwater visibility and hindered tracking. Norva Stelp's body was recovered several days later downstream, located within a submerged root structure, consistent with entanglement and transport through the river system over time. The forensic report concluded that death resulted from a combination of traumatic injury, hemorrhagic blood loss, and drowning following incapacitation caused by the crocodile attack. Wildlife officers later captured and removed a large male saltwater crocodile from the river system as a precaution after the confirmed fatal encounter. Authorities also updated warning signs and visitor guidance, stressing the need to stay well back from the waterline, especially in low visibility conditions. Jerome Katz gave a formal statement and did not speak publicly afterward. The incident stayed limited to regional coverage with no wider national attention. Norva's travel blog remained online, but inactive, later resurfacing occasionally in discussions about river safety in northern Australia. It was February 18th, 2016. A small independent river tour operation ran daily excursions along a slow-moving stretch of the Luangwa River in eastern Zambia. Flat-bottomed fiberglass vessels, no more than 10 passengers per boat. A single guide running the motor and the commentary at the same time. The river averaged about 6 feet deep in the main channel, with exposed sandbanks where hippos congregated during the cooler morning hours. Alma Brimwick was 55, a retired school administrator from Scottsdale, Arizona, on a group tour through southern Africa. The river excursion was already on the itinerary. It was not her pick, but she had opinions about it before she even stepped on the boat. She'd done 2 safaris before this, both vehicle-based, and had spent most of this trip telling anyone who'd listen that everything was too controlled and too safe. She wanted what she kept calling a real encounter. Most people pack sunscreen for a river tour. Alma packed a paddle. Most people get hippos completely wrong. They look slow and unbothered, and because they're herbivores, people assume they're passive, but none of that holds up. Adult males can push close to 9,900 pounds, move at nearly 19 miles per hour on land, and their bite force sits around 1,800 pounds per square inch. They are intensely territorial in water and will charge and capsize boats that get too close, especially when there are juveniles in the pod. The boat had been on the water about 25 minutes when the guide slowed the motor and pointed out a pod of 7 hippos resting on a sandbank about 80 feet off the side of the boat. He cut the motor to a low idle, told the group to stay seated and keep noise down, and explained that the pod had at least one juvenile, and that the adults would be watching for anything they read as a threat. Alma had been sitting with her collapsible paddle assembled across her knees since they left the dock. The guide had clocked it, but hadn't said anything yet since it wasn't in use. That changed the moment the hippos came into view. She extended the paddle over the side and started slapping the water surface in short, deliberate strokes, eyes on the pod the whole time. The guide told her to pull it in, and she told him flat out that she hadn't come all this way to sit on a boat and do nothing. He told her a second time, and she said she was a paying customer and that splashing a paddle in a river wasn't hurting anyone. She was 80 feet from a hippopod on a river in Zambia, and her complaint was that nothing was happening. Whatever a real encounter meant to her, she was about to get one. The nearest adult male, a large bull at the water's edge of the sandbank, lifted his head. His ears rotated. He slid into the water and submerged almost immediately. The guide told everyone to hold on and reached for the throttle. The hippo covered the distance underwater with no visible approach. The animal came up hard from below and to the side of the boat in a single upward lunge that lifted the right side of the vessel clean out of the water. The boat came back down hard, throwing several passengers off their seats. Alma had been leaning over the side with the paddle still in the water and went overboard on the downswing. She entered the water about 15 feet from the sandbank, and the hippo was on her within seconds. One bite to the upper torso, pulling her under immediately. The guide had the motor at full throttle and was moving the boat away. The hippo surfaced once more about 20 feet out and then didn't come up near them again. Alma didn't resurface. Emergency contact was made by radio from the boat. A recovery team reached the location about 2 hours later and found Alma's body on the riverbed in roughly 5 feet of water, about 30 feet downstream from where she went in. The guide's radio log and passenger accounts from 8 people on the boat all lined up consistently. The collapsible paddle was recovered from the water near the boat and confirmed as Alma's personal equipment, nothing the tour operator had provided. The post-mortem found the chest had been crushed beyond any survivable point, both lungs, the shoulder, everything. Cause of death was recorded as traumatic asphyxiation, with drowning as a contributing factor. Alma's repeated striking of the water near the hippopod was identified as the direct trigger. The case was ruled accidental, and the reserve faced no legal consequences. It was March 14, 2015, at a working ostrich farm on the R328 outside Oudtshoorn in the Western Cape. Vanessa had been married less than a year, trying to build a family that didn't quite want her yet, and she was losing an argument she didn't even know she was having. Vanessa Greer was 34, a secondary school administrator from Bristol, who had married Dale Greer 11 months earlier. The South Africa trip had been her idea, including a last-minute stop at an ostrich farm she booked after seeing a brochure at their guest house. Dale's children, Liam, 11, and Priya, 9, showed little interest, and as the trip grew tense, Vanessa kept pushing harder for everyone to enjoy it. Ostriches in the main enclosure, 7 adults, ranged between 220 and 280 pounds and stood close to 8 feet tall. They have forward-facing kicks powered by legs capable of delivering over 2,000 pounds of force per strike, with a single claw on each foot capable of causing severe and potentially fatal trauma to large animals, and that include us humans. You have to understand that they are not domesticated, they are managed. The guide, a farm employee named Joe, warned the group to stay behind the rope line and avoid approaching or feeding the ostriches through the fence. Vanessa interrupted twice to complain that the rules seemed excessive compared to the close-up photos advertised online. A German family on the tour later said Joe repeated the warning after Vanessa had already stepped past the rope once for a photo and laughed off the correction as overdramatic for birds. Dale quietly pulled her back, and from then on, Joe kept a closer watch on her. The German teenager had been filming parts of the tour on his phone, capturing what happened next. At the third paddock, Vanessa moved to the rope line while the group was clustered near Joe, who was discussing feeding behavior. One adult bird, later identified by farm staff as a female, had separated from the group near the far fence and was moving parallel to the rope line at a slow walk. Vanessa stepped over the rope. Joe immediately raised his voice and stepped forward to order her back, but she was already raising her phone and had crossed fully into the buffer zone. Witnesses said that she justified just taking a picture in an irritated tone before waving Joe off with one hand. Witnesses saw the bird stop walking. It turned its head. Its wings, each spanning close to 6 feet, shifted outward from its body in a distinct posture that farm staff later described as a standard threat display. People heard Joe shouting. The bird covered the remaining 12 feet in under 2 seconds. The first kick connected with her upper chest and left shoulder, and she went down sideways onto the clay. The second kick came as she was falling, striking her lower abdomen before she fully hit the ground. She did not get up. The bird stepped forward and kicked again into her side as she lay on the ground. Dale crossed the rope line and reached her, and the bird turned and kicked him once across the left forearm and hip before Joe drove it back using a long-handled distraction pole. Liam and Priya were still behind the rope. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later from a clinic on the main road. Vanessa was conscious but unresponsive to questions. She was airlifted to a hospital. Dale was treated on site for a fractured forearm and bruised hip and was discharged that evening. However, Vanessa died at 11:52 p.m. from blunt force internal injuries. The flight back was quiet, filled with administrative tasks, canceling the safari leg, arranging leave from work, and explaining to an 11-year-old why his stepmother wasn't coming home. Honestly, the tragedy was less the bird's violence and more the fact that even in her final moments, she was still arguing alone. It was June 9th, 2014. The sanctuary sat on a wide stretch of semi-rural land in Central Florida, a privately operated big cat facility that housed several rescued tigers under a paid volunteer program. Guests could book week-long stays, assist with basic enclosure maintenance, and observe feeding sessions under direct staff supervision. Roxanne Pitts was 38 years old. She was a real estate agent from Scottsdale, Arizona. She showed up on day one with the energy of someone who had already decided how the whole thing was going to go. By day 3, she was using the tigers' names in every conversation and had started referring to one of the adult females as her favorite out loud to the handlers, as though that meant something to the animal. By day 5, she had convinced herself that the tiger's calm behavior around staff was proof of a personal connection she shared with it. The handlers had seen this kind of thing before in volunteers. What they could not have predicted was how far she was willing to take it. The tiger was an adult female Bengal, 9 years old and around 280 pounds, surrendered by a private owner 6 years earlier. She was stable in familiar conditions, but she was still a wild predator, and feeding time wound her up every single time. During feeding sessions, one handler worked inside the secondary safety corridor, passing food through an interior slot while the enclosure stayed secured. Nobody else entered that corridor during an active session. That was the rule. Bengal tigers can weigh up to 350 pounds for females and significantly more for males. They can close 20 feet in under 2 seconds and generate over 1,000 pounds of bite force. Their killing bite goes to the back of the neck or the throat. The scheduled feeding for the adult female was set for 8 a.m. on June 9th. Roxanne had watched every prior session from the observation rail, always at the front, always watching the handler more than the animal. That morning, she was quieter than usual. As the handler moved toward the secondary safety corridor with the food container, Roxanne stepped out of the observation group and followed him. He told her to go back to the rail. She kept walking. She said she had watched the process enough times to know what she was doing and just wanted to be closer for her last session. She pushed through the corridor gate before he could physically block her without putting both of them in a bad position. The tiger had been pacing since 7:45 a.m. When the corridor gate opened and an unfamiliar figure walked in, she stopped and locked onto the corridor. She hit the interior chain link partition hard. The lower section of the partition bowed outward at the base, where the anchor fitting had worn down over time, opening a gap of roughly 14 inches at ground level. The impact threw Roxanne back into the outer corridor wall. She steadied herself, and instead of moving toward the gate, she took a step forward. The tiger's right forepaw came through the gap, and the claws caught Roxanne's lower left leg, pulling her forward and down to the floor. The handler was at the outer gate, working to get it open. The tiger's grip shifted from her leg to her left shoulder and upper arm and began pulling her into the partition. The gap was not wide enough to pull her through completely, but the force being applied at the contact points was severe. The emergency alarm went off. A second handler reached the corridor in under 2 minutes, deployed a deterrent through the exterior enclosure access, and the tiger moved to the far end of the enclosure. Roxanne was pulled out. Emergency services arrived about 18 minutes later. It was not enough time. The lacerations across her left leg, shoulder, and upper arm had already done too much damage. Her left shoulder had multiple fractures from being repeatedly forced into the chain link. The head injury from the initial impact against the corridor wall was flagged as a contributing factor, likely the reason she stayed on the floor instead of getting herself back to the gate. Corridor camera footage captured the full sequence. The gate latch was found open, consistent with being pushed through before it was secured. The case was ruled accidental death. The facility's protocols were reviewed and found to be sound. The only thing that had failed that morning was Roxanne's judgment. It was August 14, 2015, in a local zoo in Knoxville, Tennessee. Summer humidity clung to the concrete walkways as visitors moved through the big cat section under a clear sky. A male Amur tiger paced inside his enclosure, occasionally passing near the viewing fence as guests paused to watch. 47-year-old Darlene Hust had driven to Bramblewood with her younger sister Wren after a tense argument earlier that morning. She worked the front desk at a dental office and was known among friends for being firm in her opinions once she settled on them. She often described animals in human terms, sometimes saying she believed they could sense emotional states. She had also developed a habit of interpreting animal behavior as personal expression rather than instinct. The Amur tiger, Cossack, was one of the zoo's adult males, weighing roughly 430 pounds. He was documented as healthy and behaviorally stable, with no prior history of aggression toward barriers or staff. After arriving at the exhibit, they followed the public path toward a side viewing area next to a staff-only corridor. The corridor was clearly marked off limits, but a maintenance gate leading into a keeper area had been left unlocked that morning during routine cleaning. Darlene entered the service corridor first, assuming it was part of a secondary viewing area. Wren followed a few steps behind. From there, Darlene pushed open the unlatched internal gate, stepping past a boundary that led into a narrow keeper transition space bordering the tiger enclosure. Unlike the main public viewing area, this zone was protected only by a single chain link barrier and was not intended for visitor access. It doesn't look dangerous at first. That's the part I think people underestimate. At the edge of the enclosure, Cossack was resting, but alert. The moment Darlene approached the fence and extended her hand toward it, the tiger reacted to the sudden movement at close range. He surged forward and struck the chain link barrier with his forelimbs, causing Darlene's arm and upper body to be forced against the fencing. The impact drove her shoulder into the metal mesh. She sustained a fractured clavicle and a shoulder dislocation from the sudden lateral force. A deep laceration opened along her forearm, where a claw passed through the chain link during the strike. Wren shouted for her to move back, but the confined space limited her ability to pull Darlene away quickly. As Darlene tried to withdraw her arm, Cossack struck again through the barrier, hooking his claws into the upper portion of her arm and pulling her closer to the fence. The resulting force caused additional trauma to the shoulder complex, including likely soft tissue and nerve injury, consistent with severe blunt force traction. Darlene lost her footing on the uneven ground of the service corridor, collapsing against the base of the fence. At that moment, the unsecured internal gate behind her remained open, and she fell backward through it into the enclosure's inner boundary area. Now, inside the enclosure space, separation from the tiger was no longer protected by the primary visitor barrier. Cossack closed the distance within seconds and bit into her right thigh. The bite force caused a severe, comminuted fracture of the femur, along with extensive soft tissue crushing. The animal tightened its grip and shook her, which caused more internal damage and rapid blood loss. She lost consciousness shortly after the attack escalated. In situations like that, it's no longer about fixing what already happened. It's just about trying to get things under control. Zoo staff immediately went into emergency lockdown as soon as the breach was noticed. A keeper radioed for full containment while others moved in to secure the area. A deterrent hose was deployed from an elevated position in an attempt to push the animal back, but it did not disengage or leave the area. Knoxville EMS was dispatched at once, but was held outside the perimeter until the enclosure was confirmed secure. Once responders were allowed entry, Darlene Hust was already deceased. The medical examiner attributed the death to catastrophic blood loss from severe traumatic injuries, including major vascular damage to the thigh and blunt force trauma to the upper body. An internal investigation later confirmed that the incident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted keeper transition zone and the failure to secure an internal service gate. The primary enclosure barriers were found to be structurally intact. Following the incident, the zoo implemented revised protocols requiring secondary locking systems on all internal staff gates and reinforced access controls between service corridors and animal-adjacent zones. Cossack was retained in captivity. As investigators concluded, the attack was a direct consequence of human entry into a restricted area rather than a breach of enclosure integrity. It was November 7th, 2015. A small private game reserve ran guided walking safaris through a stretch of mixed bushveld in the Limpopo province of South Africa. Dense acacia scrub broken up by open grassland and dry riverbeds. Not a fenced tourist park. Working wilderness, small groups of no more than 6, led by a single armed field guide. The afternoon walk had departed at 3:45 p.m. with a plan to be back before dusk around 6:15. Cora Drumwell was 48, a senior buyer for a retail chain based in Charlotte, North Carolina, traveling through southern Africa on a private itinerary she'd put together herself. She'd never done a walking safari before. She'd booked this one specifically after reading about it and deciding it was the most immersive wildlife experience available. What she didn't account for was that immersive also meant following someone else's lead the entire time, and that part she had no interest in. She'd been openly criticizing the guide to the other walkers for most of the trek, telling them he clearly didn't know where the leopard was, that they were covering the same ground twice, and that the whole thing felt like a waste of an afternoon. The guide had spent the better part of an hour tracking fresh signs, pug marks in soft soil near a dry riverbed, a partially cached impala carcass wedged in a low acacia about 300 yards back. But Cora had already made up her mind that he was lost, and nothing he did on that walk was going to change it. Leopards are worth understanding before going any further here, because they are not animals that give you a warning. Adults range from 66 to 200 pounds for males, built entirely for ambush, most active at dawn and dusk. They attack from behind, back of the neck or the throat, one sustained bite. A leopard can sit within 10 feet of a person in dense bush and give absolutely no indication it's there whatsoever. It was approaching 5:30 p.m. when the guide stopped the group and crouched to examine a fresh pug mark in the soil. The leopard had passed through within the last hour based on the moisture at the edge of the print. He signaled everyone to hold position and stay tight. Cora had been drifting to the back of the group for the last 20 minutes, consistently falling a few steps behind, pausing, putting distance between herself and the guide every time he wasn't looking her way. He gestured her forward twice, and she'd complied briefly both times before drifting back again. She didn't hold position this time either. While the guide was crouched over the pug mark, Cora picked up a dry stick from the ground and started snapping it and dragging it through the bush cover off to the left of the path. She'd seen something similar in a wildlife program once and decided that was how you flushed an animal out of cover. She was done waiting. She moved further left, away from the group, snapping branches, rustling the scrub, working her way along the edge of the thicket at dusk, in active leopard territory. The guide stood up and turned toward her. He was already moving in her direction. The leopard came out of the acacia thicket to Cora's left and hit her from behind before anyone had registered it was there, driving her face down onto the ground and biting down on the back of her neck immediately. The guide fired a single shot into the air within seconds. The leopard released and was gone back into the scrub, the whole thing over in under 10 seconds. Cora was face down and unresponsive, and the guide reached her within seconds, rolling her carefully. The neck wound was severe, and the damage was immediately obvious. He got on the satellite communicator, relayed their position, and a vehicle came out from the main camp about 4 miles away via Fire Road and got there roughly 35 minutes after the attack. Cora Drumwell was confirmed dead at the vehicle. The leopard's bite went straight through the back of her neck, fracturing 2 vertebrae and severing the spinal cord. Fatal on contact. No window. Nothing anyone could have done. Claw lacerations on her upper back and left shoulder were consistent with the force of the strike. Cause of death was spinal cord severance. The satellite log, pug mark evidence, and the cached impala carcass all confirmed the timeline and active leopard territory in that area. Every account from the group lined up, and the guide's conduct was cleared. Cora's decision to break away and disturb the bush cover at dusk was identified as the sole contributing factor, and the case was closed as accidental. It was March 14, 2018, at a private conservancy in southern Kenya. Janelle had earned this trip, 2 years of planning, a private vehicle, a premium experience she had paid for in full, but the Savannah doesn't accept receipts. Janelle Whitcomb was 41, an American expatriate based in Dubai. The Kenya safari had been 2 years in the planning. Positioned in her mind as a personal milestone, she had earned according to her few friends that tolerated her. She had budgeted for a premium conservancy experience, hired a private vehicle and guide, and arrived with 2 camera bodies, a telephoto lens, and a phone permanently raised at eye level. I think what made Janelle's presence difficult was not impatience alone, but a consistent pattern of overriding professional instruction. Her guide, Osei, a licensed tracker with 11 years of field experience, had logged her behavior twice before the 3rd morning. The day prior, at a lion sighting, she opened the unlatched vehicle door before he had finished assessing wind direction. That evening, during a buffalo approach, she stood upright in the open roof hatch after being told to sit. He spoke to her firmly, both times. She said he was being overcautious, and that she had done this before. Osei had seen fresh leopard signs along the drainage ditch that morning. Pug marks, a half-eaten impala, the musky scent of a predator holding territory. Most safari guests do not treat leopards with enough distance. Adults average 80 to 200 pounds, with forelimbs and shoulders built to pull down larger prey. A leopard in this context is typically defensive, not predatory toward vehicles, but will escalate rapidly if cornered or approach too closely at a kill. Osei stopped the vehicle about 40 yards back. A large male was visible at the ditch's edge, half hidden by scrub, crouched over the kill but already alert, head lifting, ears flattening. Through the open roof hatch, Osei told Janelle to remain seated and keep movement minimal. Twice she ordered him to move closer, stressing that she paid him to obey. He declined. The drainage cut behind the animal limited its retreat, he explained, so any pressure would be read as a threat. She told him this was exactly what she had paid to see, and that he was managing the experience for himself, not for her. During a brief moment when Osei shifted the vehicle forward slightly to improve distance and angle without leaving the cabin, Janelle pushed open the rear side door, which had not yet been secured after the stop, and stepped out. She moved approximately 15 feet from the vehicle toward the ditch edge, before Osei's voice from inside the vehicle becomes sharp and direct as he notices her through the side mirror and turns his attention fully toward her movement. The leopard, which had been stationary, registered her movement and pivoted from the edge of cover rather than open ground, committing once the perceived distance collapse became immediate. It did not hesitate. The charge from its position to contact covered roughly 20 feet in under 2 seconds. The impact knocked her backward and to the left into the low scrub bordering the ditch. She did not fall cleanly. Her right leg caught on a root cluster, and she went down at an angle, partially inverted. The animal made contact a second time while she was grounded, its jaws closing on her lower abdomen before Osei's shout caused it to release and spring back into cover. Osei secured the brake, grabbed the mounted radio, and exited only after confirming the leopard had withdrawn into vegetation, then ran to retrieve a medical kit. The leopard withdrew further into the drainage brush. Janelle was conscious when Osei reached her. She had 2 injuries, a claw rake to the right hip and upper thigh, and a bite to the lower abdomen. The abdominal wound was critical. Osei applied direct pressure with a field kit and radioed the Conservancy Patrol immediately. She died from blood loss approximately 30 to 40 minutes later during evacuation coordination before the aircraft arrived in the field. The guide followed every correct protocol. The warnings were given, repeated, and documented. I think what is genuinely difficult about this case is not the animal's behavior. Leopards do exactly what leopards do. It is the fact that the word no from a trained professional had become, somewhere along the way, just an opening position. It was August 3rd, 2015. The Reptile Facility was a small, privately run attraction on the outskirts of a rural town in northern Queensland, Australia. It had been operating for several years, drawing tourists passing through the region who wanted a close look at some of the largest reptile species in the world. Glorine Taft was 51 years old. She was a retired school administrator from Tucson, Arizona, and she had driven nearly 3 hours with her adult daughter to visit the facility as part of a self-planned road trip. Glorine was the kind of person who had spent decades running buildings full of people and never really switched that off. She questioned the no flash photography rule within the first 20 minutes of arriving. She complained to a second staff member about the feeding schedule not being convenient enough for visiting guests, and said she thought the rule was unnecessary. She was 20 minutes in and already running the place in her head. The enclosure at the end of the corridor held a single adult male saltwater crocodile, estimated at around 14 feet in length and close to 1,000 pounds. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptile species on Earth and are responsible for more fatal attacks on humans than any other crocodilian. They are ambush predators with a bite force that exceeds 3,700 pounds per square inch, the strongest of any living animal. At close range, the strike is essentially instantaneous. The feeding slot built into the lower section of the enclosure wall was a narrow opening used exclusively by trained staff. It was designed to pass food through and nothing else. The scheduled feeding had taken place at 11 UAM. Saltwater crocodiles remain highly alert near the feeding wall for a significant period after a feeding session. A sign posted directly above the slot stated this clearly. Glorine had watched the feeding from the viewing rail. When it was over, she went up to a staff member and asked if she could feed the animal herself. She was told the session was done and that guests did not take part in the feedings. She rephrased the request, made it sound like a small thing, and asked again. The answer was the same. The staff member walked away. At 11:34 a.m., Glorine walked back to the enclosure on her own. Can you imagine being that convinced you knew better than everyone working there? The slot in the enclosure wall was covered by a hinged metal plate that closed with a simple hand-turn latch. It was built for staff to use quickly during feeding sessions, and nobody had ever thought to make it harder to open because walking back there alone was not something anyone expected a visitor to do. Glorine reached into her bag, took out a piece of food she had picked up from the facility cafe earlier, and pushed her right arm through the opening up to about mid-forearm. The crocodile had not moved far from the wall since the morning feeding. He struck before her arm had fully cleared the opening. The bite closed around her forearm, and the momentum of the strike drove her body forward into the concrete wall with enough force to dislocate her right shoulder on impact. The slot geometry prevented the animal from executing a full lateral roll, but the grip held completely. He did not release. Her daughter was standing about 15 feet back when it happened. Staff responded quickly, but the facility ran a single handler shift on weekday mornings, and the intervention kit was stored in the rear handling area rather than staged at the enclosure. Retrieving it took around 4 minutes. The crocodile let go when staff got in through the upper enclosure access. By that point, Glorine had already lost consciousness against the wall. Emergency services were called immediately, but given the rural location, they took around 22 minutes to arrive. Glorine Taft was pronounced dead at the scene. The post-mortem found the bite had crushed most of the bone in her right forearm and severed the major blood vessels. She bled out before help could reach her. Security footage confirmed she opened the cover herself. The case was ruled accidental death. No staff member was found at fault. The hand-turn fastener was replaced with a keyed lock. It was June 29, 2016, at Folly Beach, South Carolina. The tide had receded, exposing wide stretches of wet sand marked with seaweed, shells, and scattered debris beneath a humid, gray morning sky. Along the rack line, several Portuguese man-of-war lay partially buried and easily mistaken for ordinary jellyfish by casual beachgoers. Tamsin Broyle, 52, had retired 2 years earlier from her job as a school cafeteria supervisor in Somerville after a knee injury ended nearly 2 decades of work. In retirement, she lived a quiet routine focused on gardening, television nature programs, and long conversations with neighbors. Friends described her as self-assured in her opinions, sometimes to the point of dismissing caution when she believed she already understood a situation. She managed mild hypertension with daily lisinopril, but was otherwise independent and active. She had come to the coast for a short weekend trip with her neighbor, Colette Bram, and Colette's husband. It was her first time at the ocean in several years, and she had initially hesitated before agreeing, preferring familiar environments, but eventually accepting the invitation. Portuguese man-of-war aren't actually jellyfish. They're siphonophores, made up of different parts working together, like one organism. Even when they're washed up on the beach, their tentacles can still sting. They're covered in tiny stinging cells, called nematocysts, that can fire on contact, causing sudden, intense pain, angry skin reactions, and sometimes more serious symptoms, depending on how much contact there is and how sensitive the person is. A local man walking his dog passed along the shoreline and warned nearby beachgoers to avoid several washed-up specimens. Most people stepped back. Tamsin, however, moved closer, drawn by curiosity. Colette called out for her to be careful, pointing toward posted warning signs, but Tamsin dismissed the concern, assuming the risk was minimal since the organism was no longer in the water. She crouched beside one specimen that was partially buried in wet sand and reached out to examine it more closely. Believing she was simply observing it, she lifted the translucent float sack with her right hand. From the outside, it looks harmless. In reality, the danger is already on contact, not after. Almost immediately, hidden tentacles beneath the sand and attached to the float made full contact with her wrist and forearm. The movement against the skin triggered multiple simultaneous nematocyst discharges, producing instant, severe burning pain. She dropped the organism within seconds, but exposure had already occurred across a wide area of skin. Within moments, a sharply defined, linear rash appeared along her forearm, following the path of contact. The skin became rapidly inflamed, developing raised welts and patchy swelling, Small fluid-filled blisters began forming along the affected areas as the inflammatory response intensified. The pain escalated quickly, radiating up her arm and becoming difficult to tolerate. Tamsin quickly stood and tried to move away, appearing severely distressed. Within minutes, she became lightheaded, nauseated, and weak, with rapid breathing and sweating consistent with an acute stress response to intense pain. Colette returned briefly with water and found her sitting unsteadily on the sand, pale, confused, and struggling to speak in short phrases. Her breathing was labored, and she was unable to stand without support. Nearby beachgoers assisted while emergency services were called. Her condition continued to deteriorate over several minutes, with increasing drowsiness and reduced responsiveness. She then collapsed onto her side and began vomiting as systemic effects progressed. Even with help nearby, the body can still spiral faster than response times. Before EMS arrived, she lost consciousness as her breathing became irregular and progressed to respiratory failure, followed shortly by cardiac arrest consistent with severe systemic envenomation and physiological stress. Folly Beach EMS arrived promptly, initiated CPR and advanced life support on the shoreline, and continued resuscitation during transport to MUSC Health Colleton Medical Center. Despite prolonged efforts, Tamsin Broyle was pronounced dead later that morning. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest following severe systemic reaction to Portuguese man-of-war envenomation, with hypertension and acute stress response as contributing factors. The case was classified as a rare, severe, toxic reaction to marine cnidarian exposure, with evidence of severe systemic inflammatory and cardiovascular reaction following extensive envenomation. Following the incident, local authorities issued a public advisory regarding Portuguese man-of-war sightings along the coast that week and reinforced warning signage in affected beach areas. It was June 22, 2014. A small private big cat facility sat on a rural property about 12 miles outside a mid-sized town in central Florida. A privately run operation offering paid walkthrough tours and closer viewing sessions near the primary cat enclosures. Heavy gauge chain link fencing, a secondary rope line about 6 feet in front of each enclosure, 91 degrees Fahrenheit with no cloud cover, and it wasn't even noon yet. Maeve Pulford was 47, an office supervisor from Gainesville who had driven out with her sister for what she'd been calling a bucket list trip for weeks. She'd never been anywhere near a tiger before that day, but you genuinely would not know that. From listening to her, she had opinions about big cat behavior, and she was not keeping them to herself. Most people have no real frame of reference for what a Bengal tiger actually is up close. Adult males run between 400 and 570 pounds and can hit 40 miles per hour over short distances. Bite force around 1,050 pounds per square inch, enough to go straight through bone. They are ambush predators through, and anything that holds their attention from outside an enclosure, noise, movement, sustained eye contact, can flip a predatory response fast. When that happens, the animal isn't sizing you up anymore. It's already decided. The tour moved through several enclosures before reaching the main tiger viewing area. The handler had been clear from the start. Stay behind the rope line, no sudden movements, no noise directed at the animals. Maeve spent most of the tour talking over him, telling the people around her that big cats are naturally drawn to nurturing behavior, and that handlers at places like this tend to overcomplicate things for liability reasons. The handler corrected her directly, and she responded by asking him how long he'd actually worked with big cats, then carried on with what she was saying. She had also come prepared. Somewhere between the entrance and the tiger enclosure, she had pulled out a piece of fruit she'd brought from outside the facility. She was already holding it by the time the group reached the viewing area, which tells you exactly where her head was at before she even got there. The adult male inside was pacing slowly along the far side when the group arrived. Maeve moved to the front, closest to the rope line, and watched him for about a minute. Then she crouched down, crossed the rope line without anyone catching it right away, and pushed the fruit through the feeding hatch at the base of the fence. Then she made a low, soft sound, the kind you'd use to call a house cat. The tiger stopped pacing. She was crouched at the base of a tiger enclosure, pushing food through the fence, while the handler was actively telling her to stop. At some point, the confidence had completely overtaken whatever common sense was left. She pushed a second piece through. The tiger had fully oriented toward her now, weight shifting forward, ears flat. The handler moved in immediately, telling her to step back and get her hand away from the gap. She pulled back slightly, but stayed right where she was. Then she pushed a third piece through. The tiger hit the chain link at full speed with zero buildup and drove its right forepaw through the gap at mid-fence height. The claws caught Maeve at the left side of the neck. tearing through the jugular vein and carotid artery and dragged down across her upper chest in a single motion. She went down hard several feet back from the fence. Her sister was screaming. The handler was already next to Maeve on the ground. The neck wound was bleeding fast and heavily, and nothing on site was going to slow that down. Emergency services were called immediately and got there in about 19 minutes. It wasn't enough time. Maeve Pulford was pronounced dead on site. The post-mortem put time of death between 12 and 16 minutes after the strike. The external jugular vein and carotid artery had both been severed, and with no surgical capability anywhere close to that location, there was no realistic window to work with. Cause of death was exsanguination from the jugular laceration, with a hairline clavicle fracture noted as a secondary finding from the force of the strike. Fruit residue at the base of the fence matched what she had brought in. The chain link was examined and came back completely intact, the gap standard specification and unaltered. Every account from the tour group pointed to the same sequence of events. Handler's conduct was reviewed and cleared. The case was ruled accidental, and the facility was cleared of any responsibility. It was August 14, 2017, on the eastern boundary of Etosha National Park, Namibia. You might think a person who podcasts about service failures would read a room or a savanna. Lorraine Pask was 45, a consumer advocacy podcaster from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her format was simple. She traveled, documented failures in hospitality, escalated complaints to management, secured refunds or upgrades on camera, and monetized the footage. I already hate this. She had done it with airlines, cruise lines, boutique hotels, and rental car companies. The safari was her self-described super episode, a 10-day Namibia-Botswana trip meant to fill an entire season of content. She had already filed complaints about thread count, generator noise, and breakfast temperature, and kept pushing to dine alone in total darkness with no staff or guests visible on camera. Officially, she claimed it was for audio quality. In reality, a posthumously published note from her producer revealed she planned to expose the lodge by proving its wilderness dining experience was staged and safe so she could demand the trip be refunded. She'd built her career around manufactured outrage, but even by her standards, I think it's vicious. The surrounding bush that evening was dry scrub, low acacia, and open sand, exactly the habitat spotted hyenas exploit after dark. They are not scavengers that stumble onto meals. They are among the most successful large predators in Africa, with jaws capable of generating over 1,000 pounds per square inch of force, enough to crack the femur of a giraffe. A single adult weighs between 90 and 190 pounds. Their approach is often silent and cautious, relying on opportunity rather than immediate confrontation. Lodge staff had logged 3 hyena sightings within 400 meters of the perimeter fence in the 6 days prior to the 14th, and the security briefing conducted that afternoon for all guests explicitly referenced elevated activity. A laminated advisory card had been placed in every room, and Lorraine likely saw it too. She was sitting at a table positioned roughly 30 feet beyond the perimeter, lighting inside a low visibility extension of the dining deck approved only for escorted use. She scoffs when the ranger offers an escort during the safety speech, like the very suggestion is an insult to her intelligence. She said that she has a reservation, and she knows how to walk to a deck. The second time, at 7:42, a staff member dares to approach her table again. Same offer, same waste of her time. She doesn't even lift her head from her phone, just flicks a hand sideways, as if shooing a fly. I think that the gesture says everything. At 8:11 p.m., lodge cameras captured movement near the tree line about 60 feet away, followed by a second shape 2 minutes later. She didn't react. At 8:14, she looked into the darkness, likely assuming it was staff. By then, the hyena had slipped through the brush to within roughly 15 feet. When she stood, it charged from cover and slammed into her midsection, knocking her backward hard enough for nearby guests to hear her scream and the chair scrape violently across the stone patio. The animal clamps onto her left flank and upper thigh area and pulls violently while she tries to brace herself against the overturned table. The force drags her partially across the stone deck before she falls fully onto her side. Staff behind the secured perimeter activated floodlights and air horns within seconds. The hyena immediately disengaged under the sudden lighting and acoustic deterrents and retreated into the brush without re-engagement. 2 lodge employees and an armed ranger reached her within seconds of the hyena retreating. She was still conscious and trying to speak, but severe wounds to her abdomen and upper thigh caused rapid blood loss. Staff pressed towels and table linens against the injuries while applying pressure bandages from a trauma kit as the ranger covered the tree line with his rifle. They dragged her back inside the secured light perimeter, but witnesses said she quickly became unresponsive and died before the evacuation vehicle arrived. Staff later reported the same hyena had become habituated to food waste around several lodges that dry season. This might sound mean, but dismissing armed rangers who knew the land better than your ego doesn't make you a savvy consumer advocate. It makes you a walking liability, and getting yourself killed on camera was the only refund you truly earned. It was August 29th, 2013. The guided trek operated out of a small outfitter near the eastern edge of a wilderness area in northwestern Montana. The route covered about 9 miles of backcountry terrain over 2 days, with an overnight camp roughly halfway through. Harriet Good was 55 years old. She was a semi-retired attorney from Billings, Montana, and she led with that fact like it meant something out here. She had hiked recreationally her whole adult life and had never once had a bear encounter, which she treated as proof of competence rather than luck. During the briefing, she asked questions that were really just her own opinions, framed as curiosity. By the time the group set out, she had already decided the guide knew less about this trail than she did. Decades of hiking, without incident, had convinced her that her judgment was sound. The problem was, she had never been tested. Grizzly bears are among the most dangerous large mammals in North America. Adult females average between 290 and 400 pounds, and adult males can reach up to 790 pounds. They can outrun any human on any terrain. A grizzly defending a food cache does not bluff. It attacks immediately, and it does not stop. The group set out at 7:30 a.m. The first 4 miles were uneventful. At around 10:45 a.m., the trail passed through a dense stand of lodgepole pine and alder, with visibility down to about 15 feet on either side. About a quarter mile before this section, the guide picked up a strong carrion smell. He stopped the group. A large carcass in dense cover that close to the trail meant one thing. He told everyone to tighten up, get their bear spray out, and keep moving without stopping. Harriet said it was probably a deer that died naturally, and that he was reading too much into it. He told her that was possible, and that the protocol stood regardless. She complied. Barely. About 200 yards in the trail, curved sharply around a large rock outcrop. The guide came around first and stopped. A partially consumed elk carcass sat about 30 feet off the left side of the trail, freshly covered in pine duff and broken branches. He signaled the group to halt and started moving everyone backward. 4 of the 5 guests went immediately. Harriet had come around the curve and seen the carcass. She stopped but did not go back. The guide stepped in front of her and told her to move. She said she wanted to see if the bear was close. He told her again. She stepped around him. The grizzly had been in the brush between the carcass and the trail the whole time. She came out fast, with no warning. The guide discharged his bear spray at about 10 feet, caught her across the face, and deflected her into the rock outcrop. She recovered in under 2 seconds and reoriented. Harriet was about 6 feet behind him. The bear went straight for her. The first strike was the right forepaw, connecting with the left side of Harriet's head. The force of it put her into the brush off the side of the trail. The bear went in after her. The guide discharged a second burst toward the brush and moved in shouting. The bear paused and turned toward him. He discharged the rest of the canister into her face from close range, and she broke off, moving back in the direction of the carcass. He found Harriet in the brush about 15 seconds later, on the ground, and unresponsive. He activated his emergency beacon immediately. The nearest ground team was 3 hours out by trail, and the cloud ceiling grounded any air response until morning. He stayed with her. She died about 40 minutes after the attack. The forepaw strike had fractured her skull and caused severe bleeding in her brain. That was what killed her. Deep lacerations across the left side of her face and neck, and a separate wound to her abdomen from a follow-up strike were also noted. Surviving that kind of head injury without immediate surgery was not possible, and surgery was 3 hours away at minimum. Her bear spray was found still clipped to her pack, safety tab intact. She never touched it. The beacon log and physical evidence at the scene matched the guide's account. The female grizzly was monitored after, but not destroyed. The death was recorded as accidental, with failure to retreat on direct instruction listed as the primary contributing factor. It was July 18th, 2013, in Yellowstone National Park's Lamar Valley. Early morning light stretched across open grassland and river bends, while dense willow thickets along the water's edge limited visibility just off the main hiking trail. Phyllis Dorn, 55, from Rapid City, South Dakota, was an experienced visitor to the park. She returned almost every summer and was familiar with staying on marked trails and maintaining distance from wildlife. However, she also believed she could often interpret animal behavior correctly and tended to underestimate risk if animals appeared calm. She was hiking with her friend Ruth Pell, 60, who was visiting Yellowstone for the first time. The trail through Lamar Valley was wide and relatively flat, bordered in sections by thick willow growth that could easily conceal large animals until they were very close. American black bears are common in Yellowstone, and females with cubs are among the most defensive wildlife in the park. Encounters can escalate rapidly if a bear perceives a threat to its young, especially at close range, where escape routes are limited and reaction time is short. Phyllis and Ruth spotted a young black bear cub near the edge of the brush, just a few steps off the trail. Ruth immediately told her to back up, and other hikers coming the opposite way started calling out the same thing, warning that the mother was probably nearby. When even strangers around you start warning the same thing, that's usually your cue to move. People began urging everyone to slowly move away together, keeping their distance from the brush. Phyllis remained where she was, keeping her attention on the cub. She believed it was safe at their distance and continued observing it, while others began to increase space between themselves and the brush line. Ruth hesitated, but shifted several steps back onto the trail. Unknown to them, the mother bear was moving through the willow thicket behind and slightly to the side of the group. The vegetation and uneven terrain obscured her until she was already within close range. At that point, she detected the presence of humans near her cub and began a defensive response. She first emerged partially from the brush in a bluffing posture, then immediately committed to a charge. The distance was short, and she closed it in a few seconds in a direct sprint. The impact struck Phyllis from the side, knocking her off the trail and into the grass. She fell hard, disoriented from the force of the collision. The bear followed immediately, targeting her upper body. The first bite locked onto her upper arm and shoulder area, causing severe soft tissue damage and a fracture of the humerus. In the process, a major blood vessel in the arm was likely damaged, leading to significant bleeding. Phyllis cried out as the bear shook its head briefly before releasing and repositioning. The bear then shifted and went for the back of her head. The force of the bite was devastating, causing a severe skull fracture and serious brain injury. She lost consciousness almost immediately from the impact. Nearby hikers shouted and tried to deter the bear from a distance, but none approached the immediate area. The bear remained for a short time over the victim, alert and defensive, before dragging her a short distance into the grass. It then disengaged and moved back toward the direction of the cub, disappearing into the willow cover. Ruth and other hikers reached Phyllis shortly after the bear withdrew. She was found unconscious with severe head trauma and a serious arm injury with heavy bleeding. She did not regain consciousness. At that point, it was already beyond what bystanders could change. Park rangers arrived quickly and secured the scene. Medical personnel confirmed death at the site following field assessment. The official report listed the cause of death as severe traumatic brain injury from a bear-inflicted skull fracture, with significant blood loss from the arm injury as a contributing factor. Wildlife officials later located and euthanized the mother bear under established park protocol for a fatal defensive encounter involving humans. The cub was captured and transferred to rehabilitation care. The incident was later classified as a defensive attack, triggered by close human proximity to a cub in dense vegetation with limited visibility. Ruth Pell received treatment for shock and returned to lodging later that day. She did not continue hiking for the remainder of the trip. It was August 9th, 2017. A small independent tour operation ran shallow water marine encounters out of a narrow inlet on the southeastern coast of Florida, about 6 miles from the nearest populated shoreline. Flat-bottomed boat, a single guide, and a sandbar where nurse sharks had been congregating naturally for years. Shay Portwell was 39, a marketing coordinator from Atlanta, on a 4-day coastal trip with 2 friends. She had found the shark encounter through a local activity board at their accommodation and signed the whole group up without asking anyone first. She had no diving or snorkeling experience and had never been in open water with marine animals before. On the boat ride out, she told the group that nurse sharks were basically harmless and the most docile sharks in the water. She said it like she'd been diving with sharks her whole life. Here's the thing though, nurse sharks and bull sharks are not the same animal, and that distinction ended up mattering more than anything else that day. Nurse sharks are slow, bottom-dwelling, generally unbothered unless grabbed or harassed. Bull sharks are a completely different situation. They average 7 to 8 feet, weigh up to 500 pounds, and are considered one of the most aggressive shark species in the world. They're drawn to low-frequency vibrations in the water, the kind generated by a struggling or thrashing animal. They don't need much of a reason to come in. The guide ran through the briefing before anyone got in. Don't grab the sharks. Don't chase them. Don't block their path. Stay still if one approaches. He also flagged that the incoming tide occasionally pushed other species into the inlet, and that everyone needed to exit immediately on his signal. Nothing complicated, nothing unclear. Shay was in the water less than 5 minutes before she started cutting off one of the nurse sharks, repositioning herself directly in its path and forcing it to redirect around her. Then she started slapping the water surface flat with her palm. Once, then again, then repeatedly in this deliberate rhythmic pattern. The guide moved toward her and told her to stop. She told him she'd read that certain water movements attract sharks and that she was just trying to get a better experience since they'd paid good money for the tour. She was deliberately generating vibrations in open water to pull in more sharks, with other people standing in that same water around her. I don't know what she thought was going to show up. More nurse sharks? She kept going. The guide was already signaling the group toward the boat. The water around Shay was churning with the kind of low-frequency disturbance that carries a long way underwater. The bull shark had likely already been pushed close to the sandbar by the incoming tide. The sustained surface disturbance gave it something to orient on. It came in fast and low from the north and hit Shay at the left side of the abdomen in a single pass before anyone in that water had time to react. The force lifted her partially out of the water, and she went face down within seconds. The guide reached her first and pulled her toward the boat with help from another participant. Getting her out of the water took about 90 seconds. The bull shark made one more pass near the boat but didn't strike again. The guide had a trauma kit on board, but the wound was open and severe, and there wasn't much he could do beyond applying pressure. He radioed for emergency assistance immediately. A response vessel reached them in just under 25 minutes. Shay Portwell was airlifted from the response vessel. She died during transport. The guide's radio log and GPS data were both recovered. A waterproof camera mounted on the boat's console had been running the entire time and captured everything. All 4 remaining tour participants gave accounts that matched the footage. The abdominal wound told the whole story at postmortem. One bite that tore open the left abdomen, severing a major artery and destroying surrounding tissue. Cause of death was hemorrhagic shock. 6 miles from shore, with that kind of internal damage, there was never going to be enough time. Shay's repeated slapping of the water surface was identified as a significant contributing factor in the shark's approach. The case was ruled accidental, and no charges were filed. It was July 14th, 2018, in a conservancy in Kruger. Somewhere in the Lowveld scrub, a 420-pound male lion was about to teach a Karen a lesson no Instagram caption could capture. Danae Murray was 31 and had spent the better part of 3 years in Johannesburg, building a career that moved fast because she made it. She had pushed for this trip, a guided night safari in the greater Kruger area, as a birthday trip for herself, according to her coworkers who listened to her talk nonstop about it. She had booked a premium vehicle with a private guide because, according to her, apparently, half measures were not something she did. Her husband Liam had followed her lead on most of the planning. People who knew them said that was generally how things went. I think she genuinely believed that most warnings were written for the weakest person in the room and that she was not that person. Friends said that Liam had learned not to argue with her about it directly. However, the guide that evening, a man named Jacob, who had run night drives in this conservancy for 11 years, had not yet learned to read her. Jacob had announced over the radio at 8:40 p.m. that 2 other guides in the area had tracked a male lion moving through the central drainage corridor earlier that evening. Lions are Africa's apex terrestrial predator. Adult males can reach 420 pounds and nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, built entirely around explosive short-distance speed and the mechanics of bringing down large animals. They are not incidental dangers. A lion that feels cornered, surprised at close range, or provoked in low light will charge with very little warning beyond subtle posture, changes most tourists do not recognize quickly enough. When the vehicle stopped at a water point and Jacob instructed everyone to remain seated, Danae asked him if he always treated adults like they were children. Liam said nothing. The engine idled. Jacob said politely, addressing everyone, that lions can kill people. Then he said it again, looking at Danae specifically. She told Liam that Jacob was being dramatic. As the lion shifted closer through the drainage line, the brush parting silently ahead of him, Jacob raised his voice again, warning that the animal was watching the vehicle and to stay still. Witnesses later said the lion had lifted his head higher and fixed directly on the movement coming from Danae's side of the vehicle. Danae was still inside the vehicle, but had partially opened the door and stepped 1 foot onto the running board in order to steady her filming angle. The phone held out and angled back at her face in shaky low light. laughing, tracking toward the brush line, while Jacob immediately shouted at her to get back inside and reached across the seat toward the open door. When the lion charged, he did not vocalize. He covered the distance in several bounding strides. He simply moved, and then he was on her. The lion struck high, colliding into her upper body as she tried to pull backward through the half-open door. One paw hit across her chest and shoulder hard enough to spin her sideways off the running board, while the animal's weight carried both of them into the buffalo thorn beside the track. Witnesses described hearing the brush crack first, followed immediately by Danae, screaming once before the lion clamped onto the upper part of her torso near the neck and shoulder area. Liam ran toward her almost immediately and was struck aside by a glancing paw swipe that knocked him flat into the dirt. By the time Jacob and the other passengers began shouting and advancing toward the lion from the vehicle, the animal had already retreated back toward the brush line. Liam got up. Danae did not. A vehicle from a neighboring guide unit made the emergency call. Danae was loaded and airborne an hour later. She died from her injuries before they reached the clinic. After the attack, Liam returned to Johannesburg alone and eventually left his job and sold their shared apartment. The real tragedy isn't that she thought the world was bigger than her comfort zone. It's that she never understood why some boundaries exist to keep the wild from becoming a wound. It was September 6th, 2016. The Wetland Preserve sat on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, a privately run operation offering guided walking and kayak tours through a network of marsh channels and interconnected lagoons. The Eastern Lagoon was the largest body of water on the property and the most heavily populated with alligators. Phyllis Halcomb was 50 years old. She was a retired insurance adjuster from Baton Rouge who had spent her whole life near wetland environments and somewhere along the way had decided that counted as expertise. She grew up near bayous, had been around alligators her whole life, and made sure the group knew that during the pre-tour briefing. The problem with growing up around something dangerous and never getting hurt by it is that eventually you stop believing it can hurt you at all. American alligators are apex predators common throughout the southeastern United States. Adult males reach up to 15 feet in length and around 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators. They sit still, stay concealed, and wait. At dusk, their ability to detect movement in low light makes them significantly harder to spot before it is too late. An attack starts with a fast surface lunge, a bite, and an immediate pull underwater. The death roll happens below the surface, and it is exactly what it sounds like. The group reached the Eastern Lagoon platform at around 6:10 p.m. The light was already going flat. The guide counted 4 alligators visible from the platform, 2 near the far bank, 1 on a mud flat to the east, and 1 that had been sitting near the platform side bank earlier, but was no longer visible. He pointed that last one out to the group. Not seeing it did not mean it had left. Phyllis had been quiet for most of the walk out. On the platform, she made up for it. She told the group alligators were slow and predictable. She said the restricted zone was excessive for anyone with basic common sense. She said she had walked bayou banks her entire life and never had a single problem, as though a lifetime without incident was proof of immunity rather than luck. The guide reminded the group they would be moving on in about 15 minutes and left her to it. At the 12-minute mark, he moved to the rear of the platform to answer questions from 2 other guests. He had his back to the lagoon for about 3 minutes. When he turned around, Phyllis was gone. She had gone down the side access steps and unlatched the gate at the bottom. She was crouching at the water's edge about 8 feet from the base of the steps, phone out, facing the lagoon. The light was low and orange by then. The water surface was dark. He called her name and moved toward the steps. The alligator had been in the water near the platform side bank the entire time. It came up fast, a surface lunge that cleared the waterline in a single motion. The bite closed on her right forearm as she instinctively raised it, and the animal's momentum drove her forward off the bank and into the water. She was under 2 seconds. The water settled almost immediately. He reached the bank within seconds, but there was nothing to see. A call went out to the preserve's main facility right away. The response team reached the Eastern Lagoon about 34 minutes later. They searched until dark and resumed at first light. Phyllis Halcomb's body was recovered the following morning, 19 hours after the attack, in about 5 feet of water near the far bank under submerged vegetation. The post-mortem confirmed she drowned. The initial bite had fractured her right forearm and 3 ribs. The injuries to her arm and torso showed the animal had death rolled with her underwater before releasing. The access gate was found open. The death was recorded as accidental. Contributing factors listed were unauthorized descent from the observation platform and deliberate approach to the water within a restricted zone at dusk. It was October 11th, 2014, on a remote trail in Peru's Manu Biosphere Reserve, where dense rainforest pressed against a narrow footpath under heavy humidity after recent rains. The ground was slick with decomposing leaves, and visibility was limited by thick understory and fallen vegetation. 51-year-old Denise Harrow from Eugene, Oregon, was on a small guided eco-tour during a solo trip through South America. She worked as a private pet groomer and had developed a strong interest in reptiles through documentaries and online communities. Friends described her as confident in her interpretations of animal behavior and skeptical of warnings she considered overly cautious, often insisting snakes were misunderstood and that calm behavior reduced risk. The group was led by Mateo Vargas, a local naturalist with over a decade of experience in the Manu region. Before entering the trail, he gave standard safety instructions, emphasizing staying on the path, keeping distance from wildlife, and never interacting with snakes or other potentially dangerous animals. It all sounded like standard safety talk, the kind you hear at the start of trips like this. The fer-de-lance pit viper, Bothrops atrox, is a very venomous snake found in the Amazon. It hides well and often stays completely still, making it hard to notice. If something gets too close, it can strike very fast from a coiled position. Its venom damages blood, destroys tissue, and can lead to severe internal bleeding and organ failure. It usually doesn't warn before attacking and may stay still until it feels threatened. Midway through the hike, Mateo stopped the group after spotting a fer-de-lance coiled just off the trail, almost hidden in the wet leaf litter. He warned everyone to stay on the path, keep their distance, and move on without stopping. The group complied, but Denise lingered, watching the snake. She said it looked calm and argued that snakes only bite when provoked. Mateo repeated more firmly that it was highly venomous and that its stillness was not a sign of safety. Denise crouched near the edge of the trail while the rest of the group moved ahead. Witnesses later said she appeared focused on observing the animal and spoke as though reassuring it rather than herself. She again stated that the snake seemed relaxed because it was not moving. Mateo stepped closer and told her firmly to move back. Denise still reached one hand, slightly off the trail, palm down, trying to show what she thought was calm, non-threatening behavior. The fer-de-lance stayed still for a few seconds, coiled up with its head facing her. Then it struck. It bit the side of her right hand between the thumb and index finger in a split second. Denise jerked back onto the trail, more in shock at first than pain. Within moments, blood started coming from the puncture wounds. Mateo pulled her fully onto the path and applied pressure immobilization, while another guide radioed for emergency evacuation support. Denise remained conscious at first, but quickly began reporting intense burning pain and rapidly increasing swelling in her hand and forearm. Within minutes, the swelling extended past the wrist, and her fingers became stiff and discolored. As the group moved toward the nearest extraction point, her condition worsened. She developed dizziness, nausea, and weakness consistent with systemic envenomation. Small areas of spontaneous bleeding appeared at the gums, indicating early disruption of normal clotting function caused by the venom. By the time they reached a clearing for evacuation coordination, she required assistance to walk. Her blood pressure had dropped significantly, and she showed signs of shock, including pale skin, confusion, and increasing difficulty remaining alert. She repeatedly insisted that the snake had not meant to hurt her. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Field responders arrived by boat several hours later and began stabilizing her for transport, but her condition continued to worsen. She lost consciousness during evacuation and went into cardiovascular collapse before reaching anti-venom care. The medical report listed death as systemic envenomation by Bothrops atrox, causing hemorrhagic shock and organ failure from severe tissue damage and blood clotting failure. Delayed access to treatment due to the remote location was a key factor. Investigators determined that the guide had followed appropriate safety procedures, including repeated verbal warnings and immediate emergency response after the incident. Following the event, the tour operator reinforced strict wildlife distance policies and updated briefing protocols, emphasizing that no wild snake should be approached or handled under any circumstances. The incident was reported locally in Peru and briefly mentioned in online herpetology discussions. Denise's family requested privacy, and no public statements were issued afterward. It was September 3rd, 2016. A small elephant interaction program operated out of a rural property on the northern edge of Chiang Mai Province, Thailand. Dirt paths, a wide open clearing with packed red earth, a shallow watering area at the far end. It was mid-morning and already pushing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that makes everything feel heavier than it should. Lupe Garston was 51, an office administrator from Phoenix, Arizona, traveling through Southeast Asia on a 2-week solo trip she had been planning for over a year. The elephant program was the centerpiece of her itinerary, booked months in advance. She had worked briefly at a petting zoo in her 20s, and she carried that around like it translated directly to handling a multi-ton wild animal. She had also noted on her booking form that she had previous experience with horses, which by that point she had apparently stacked on top of everything else as further proof that she knew what she was doing. Asian elephants are not the slow, passive animals most people picture. Adult females average between 5,000 and 8,800 pounds and can move at up to 15 miles per hour when agitated. They communicate discomfort through specific physical signals, ear position, head shaking, foot shuffling, long before they escalate physically. A mahout spends years learning to read a single individual animal. Their instructions during an interaction are not suggestions. The session started without issues. The group was introduced to 2 female elephants by their assigned mahouts. Lupe was paired with the larger of the 2, an adult female estimated at around 8,800 pounds. The mahout gave a clear briefing before any contact began. To move slowly, follow his lead, do not lay a finger on the animal, stay on the left side unless directed otherwise. For the first 10 minutes, Lupe followed along, feeding the elephant from a basket of fruit the facility provided. But her patience wore thin once the mahout began guiding the elephant in a slow arc around the clearing. Lupe had decided she wanted to walk toward the watering area instead, and when the elephant didn't respond to the direction she wanted, she reached up and grabbed the animal's left ear with one hand and pulled. She'd handled horses before, volunteered at a shelter, worked a petting zoo so clearly she knew what she was doing with an animal 20 times the size of anything she'd ever dealt with. The mahout stepped in immediately, repositioning himself and giving a firm verbal command to settle the elephant. It worked. The elephant paused. Lupe let go briefly, then grabbed the ear again with both hands, pulling downward and to the left with more force. The mahout physically placed himself between her and the elephant's head and gestured firmly for her to step back. She stepped around him and grabbed the ear a 3rd time. The elephant swung its head hard to the side to shake off the irritation. Fast, forceful, the kind of motion that doesn't leave room for reaction time. The momentum caught Lupe across the upper body and launched her sideways. She landed hard on the packed dirt several feet away and didn't move. The mahout got the elephant under control and moved it back immediately. Staff reached Lupe within minutes. She was conscious at first, responsive, but couldn't feel anything below her waist. A vehicle reached the clearing within several minutes, and she was loaded in as carefully as possible. The roads between the program site and the nearest spinal trauma facility were rough and partially unpaved, and with over 25 miles between them, the drive alone took close to 50 minutes. There was no faster option. Lupe Garston died en route. Witness accounts from 6 members of the group were consistent throughout. The mahout's conduct was reviewed and confirmed as appropriate at every point. Lupe's repeated grabbing of the elephant's ear against direct instruction was identified as the sole trigger for the animal's reaction. The post-mortem identified a burst fracture of the T12 vertebra with complete spinal cord transection at that level, consistent with the compressive force of a high-impact fall onto packed earth. 3 ribs on the left side were fractured, and the spleen was lacerated. Cause of death was neurogenic shock, secondary to complete spinal cord injury, with internal hemorrhage from the splenic laceration as a contributing factor. The case was ruled accidental, and no charges were filed. It was July 14, 2014, on the eastern bank of a channel in the Okavango Delta, Botswana, where a woman who had spent 3 years photographing animals she loved put herself in danger because she refused to believe one of them could hurt her. Maricel Kovac was 38, a secondary school science teacher from Ljubljana who had taken wildlife photography seriously, but never enough for a proper living. She was in the middle of a divorce from a man who ran guided hunts in the Slovenian highlands and had, by multiple accounts from mutual friends, spent their final 2 years together, telling her that her sentimentality about animals was embarrassing, and she fought back by cheating with one of his best friends. I mean, someone who hunts animals versus someone who appreciates them. There's a place for each of them, but definitely not in a marriage. The Botswana trip was self-funded on a tight budget, a solo slot booked into a small group safari running out of Maun. She carried a mid-range DSLR and a 400mm lens she had saved 11 months to buy. Her goal for the trip was a usable frame of a hippo surfacing at close range, something she had told another tourist on the first morning she had wanted for years. Hippopotamus are not aquatic animals in any meaningful behavioral sense. They graze on land at night and use water purely as a thermal refuge and territorial base during the day. A large adult bull can reach 7,700 pounds and move through shallow water at close to 19 miles per hour in a short charge. If you're a fan of the channel, you know they are responsible for more human fatalities annually in Africa than any other large land animal. The tour guide, a man named Deo, who had run Delta routes for 9 years, had identified a disturbance pattern in the water approximately 82 feet upstream before the group disembarked. He directed everyone to the raised viewing platform and told them explicitly not to approach the bank edge. He pointed at the surface disturbance and identified it as a submerged pod, at minimum 2 animals. Maricel then told him he was reading it wrong, that the movement was current related, and that his caution was, in her words, the same reflexive overprotection she got from people who had never actually studied these animals. 2 other tourists on the platform heard this exchange, with additional berating from Maricel that they described as demeaning the man's job. One of them later confirmed that Deo repeated the warning a second time and physically stepped in front of her as she moved toward the descent, but she shoved him multiple times and stepped around him. She removed her sandals at the platform edge and walked into the shallows until the water was just below her knees. The ripple pattern she had been photographing was approximately 59 feet out and moving slowly, though small surface ripples and intermittent snorting breaks in the water had been visible closer to the bank moments earlier, according to the other tourists. Deo was shouting hysterically from the platform, and I don't blame him. He was about to watch another entitled tourist become a statistic under his watch. The bull surfaced with a sudden forward surge, 4 feet from her position. It did not breach dramatically. It rose, which is worse, because there was almost no warning displacement before the mass of it was simply there. Maricel took 1 step backward. The animal opened its mouth and drove into her at water level. She went under in under 3 seconds of contact. The surface churned for roughly 40 seconds. Deo fired a handheld flare from the platform as a deterrent, though it had no behavioral effect at that range. The group retreated from the platform edge in disarray, while Deo continued signaling on the satellite radio. In the chaos, a 61-year-old Dutch tourist named Wim Berency tripped on the platform railing during the retreat, struck his head on the corner bracket, and sustained a fatal traumatic head injury, and was later pronounced dead at the ranger station after evacuation. As for Maricel, recovery teams worked the channel for 2 days for her. Partial remains were recovered on the 2nd day. Crocodile activity and water turbidity made full recovery impossible. Her death was ultimately ruled accidental, but I think it's suicidal. She died because she needed to be right in front of a man she decided was beneath her, and the hippo didn't care about her divorce, or her photography, or her grievances. We call it a Karen death. The entitlement, the shoving, the refusal to hear no, but really, it was just a very stupid way to prove a point that only she was still keeping score on. It was October 22nd, 2017. The walking safari route cut through a wide stretch of mixed woodland and grassland on a private reserve in southern Zimbabwe. The terrain was mostly flat, with dry riverbeds breaking it up every mile or so and patches of dense thicket pushing in from the sides. Vonnie Sears was 47 years old. She was a marketing director from Denver, Colorado, who had organized the entire 2-week trip herself and showed up to the pre-walk briefing with a printed shot list of specific animals and angles she wanted. She had done one prior safari 3 years earlier and mentioned it enough times during the briefing that the other guests had tuned her out. The lead guide ran through the safety protocols the same way he always did. Vonnie took in the parts she agreed with and dismissed the rest as overcaution. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth. Adult bulls can weigh up to 13,000 pounds and charge at 25 miles per hour. A bull in musth is a different level of dangerous entirely. Musth is a hormonal state that floods the animal with testosterone and makes it aggressive, unpredictable, and extremely easy to provoke. The visible sign is a dark, oily fluid running down the side of the face. Every guide in elephant country knows what that means. The group picked up the bull at around 9:40 a.m., about 2 miles into the walk. He was standing at the edge of a dry riverbed, partially in shade, angled away from the group. The lead guide stopped everyone and assessed from about 80 yards out. The dark staining on the bull's left cheek was visible from that distance. He signaled the group to hold and began moving them laterally to route around the animal with the wind in their favor. Vonnie stepped out of the line and went forward. She had been shooting the elephant since the group stopped, and when the guide redirected everyone sideways, she decided that was not the angle she wanted. She closed the distance to around 55 yards. The rear guide moved to cut her off. She waved him away without making eye contact and kept going, dropping into a crouch to adjust her frame. The bull turned and came. The lead guide fired into the air and shouted. The bull did not slow. Vonnie got to her feet and took 2 steps back before the animal covered the remaining distance and hit her. The bull's lowered head hit her at full speed, sent her mass, and drove her straight down into the dry riverbed. He followed with a tusk thrust into her left side before the lead guide's second shot caused him to veer off. First contact to the bull, clearing the area, was about 11 seconds. The rear guide reached her within 30 seconds. She was already unresponsive. A radio call went to base camp immediately, but the logistics worked against them. Getting her to the nearest vehicle access point required a 20-minute carry on foot, and the response team was another 45 minutes out from there. It was 68 minutes before anyone with medical training got to her. The autopsy showed multiple fatal injuries. Both sides of her chest had broken ribs from the impact with the ground. The tusk had entered her left side, collapsing the lung. Her spleen had ruptured. Any one of those injuries required immediate surgery. She was over an hour from anyone who could provide it. Her camera was recovered about 12 feet from where she fell. The last image on the memory card was a shot of the bull already mid-charge, taken at under 30 yards. She never stopped shooting. The lead guide's actions were reviewed and found to be sound at every point. The bull was monitored in the weeks after, but not destroyed. The death was recorded as accidental, with departure from the group formation and deliberate provocation of a bull and must listed as contributing factors. It was September 22, 2015, and the Ugandan sun beat down on the shrinking waterways surrounding Lake Mburo, where the dry season had compressed hippo populations into increasingly crowded channels. A small ecotourism operation offered morning boat excursions along a network of papyrus-lined channels, guided by locally trained operators. Beverlyn Treadworth was a 52-year-old property litigation attorney from Surrey, England, who had arrived in Uganda as part of a 3-week East African tour, organized through a London-based safari company. Treadworth's travel companion, a university friend, had quietly switched to a separate room at the previous lodge after growing exhausted by her behavior. Treadworth had already lodged complaints at 2 previous stops on the itinerary, one regarding bedsheet thread count and another accusing kitchen staff of ignoring dietary restrictions. The morning excursion departed in a small motorized skiff carrying Treadworth, a retired schoolteacher from Bruges, and a 25-year-old operator named Kamuntu Bwayo. Bwayo, certified by the National Wildlife Authority, briefed the group that hippopods would be observed from safe distance. Certain channels were off limits, and his navigation decisions were final. Treadworth began complaining when Bwayo maintained roughly 50 yards from the nearest pod. She pointed toward a narrow channel approximately 150 yards away, where at least 12 hippos were visible, including calves. She instructed Bwayo to enter the channel. Bwayo refused. The channel was shallow, narrow, and occupied by a dominant male he had personally observed displaying aggressive behavior on 3 previous excursions. Entering in a small skiff would place them within the male's defended territory, with no room to maneuver. Treadworth told Bwayo she would contact the National Wildlife Authority to report his refusal. She informed him that her professional connections in international tourism could ensure this operation never attracted another European client. When the retired schoolteacher suggested trusting the guide, Treadworth told her she had not asked for her opinion. Bwayo held firm and began turning back toward the main channel. Treadworth stood abruptly, stepped toward the stern, and grabbed the tiller arm, wrenching the boat's direction toward the channel mouth and momentarily disrupting Bwayo's control. He pulled her hand away, but the sudden course change had already swung the bow toward the entrance. The engine noise and abrupt vibration carried across the water. Hippopotamuses are one of the deadliest large animals in Africa by annual human fatalities. Adult males weigh between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds and can reach up to 12 to 14 feet in length. Despite their bulk, hippos move through shallow water by bounding along the bottom with surprising speed, fast enough at close range that a human cannot react in time. Their jaws can open extremely wide, exposing massive tusk-like canines with one of the strongest bite forces of any land animal. Territorial males become extraordinarily aggressive during the dry season when shrinking water forces pods into increasingly confined space. The dominant male surfaced roughly 30 feet from the bow. Its scarred head and massive jaw rose above the waterline, mouth opening in a full threat gape. Bwayo cut the engine immediately and attempted to reverse and angle the boat away from the channel. The bull submerged. Seconds of silence. Then the animal surfaced directly beside the skiff, its massive head striking the gunwale with tremendous force. The impact buckled the thin metal, and the bull's jaws clamped down and wrenched, capsizing the skiff and dumping all 3 occupants into shallow, murky water. Bwayo grabbed the schoolteacher and hauled her toward the papyrus bank. Based on witness testimony, the bull charged through the shallows at devastating speed. Its jaws came down on Treadworth's midsection, biting and crushing before lifting and tossing her partially from the water with a violent wrench of its massive head. The bull retreated toward its pod. The attack lasted seconds. Bwayo and the schoolteacher remained hidden in the papyrus until the pod settled. His radio call brought a rescue boat after a significant delay. Beverlyn Treadworth had died almost instantly from catastrophic bite trauma. The investigation determined she had physically seized boat controls against the operator's refusal, momentarily disrupting navigation and directing the vessel toward a territorial male. Bwayo was cleared of liability. The incident was logged with the National Wildlife Authority. The operation temporarily reviewed excursion protocols and implemented reinforced tiller guards and a 2-guide policy. It was September 19, 2017, in Limpopo Province, South Africa. The bush stretched flat and dry in every direction, thorn trees casting thin shadows across red earth, the morning air still carrying the last of the night's cool before the heat came in properly. Carol Weston, 57, had waited 20 years for this trip. Her ex-husband had never wanted to go, and she had shelved it the way people shelf things. They stop believing they will ever actually do. The divorce had changed that calculation. She had booked the safari 4 months after the papers were signed, posted about it extensively on social media, and arrived at the reserve 3 days earlier with new camera equipment. She had owned for 3 weeks, and a confidence built on 2 YouTube documentaries and 1 previous visit to a Florida wildlife park. The night before her flight, she had posted a caption that read, "Finally doing it for me." 34 people had liked it by the time she landed in Johannesburg. She had found things to criticize from the moment the vehicle left the gate. The seat she had been assigned was too far from the viewing side. The vehicle moved too slowly at the first sighting. The guide kept too much distance from the animals. She told the couple seated beside her that the operation felt amateur compared to what she had read about Kenyan safaris. She had never been to Kenya, and this is the part that gets me every time. She had never been to Kenya. She was comparing a real safari to one she had read about on the internet. The guide was Dumi, with 9 years of experience at the reserve. He answered her complaints without reacting to her tone and kept the vehicle moving on. Schedule. I respect guides like Dumi. After 9 years in the bush, he still managed someone like Carol without losing his composure. That is genuinely hard to do. The Pride was sighted at approximately 35 meters. 7 lions in total, 4 females, 2 subadults, and 1 dominant male, large, mature, and documented in prior reserve reports as responsive to elevated movement above vehicle level. A dominant male lion's primary behavioral role within a pride is boundary enforcement. Any movement perceived as intrusion registers as a threat. Dumi positioned the vehicle at a controlled viewing distance and told all passengers clearly to remain seated and keep their movements low. Exiting the vehicle at any point during a game drive was prohibited. It had been explained before the drive began. Carol stood up immediately. She said she could not get a clear shot from a seated position and that she was almost done. Dumi told her to sit. She kept shooting. He told her again, more, firmly. She told him she had paid for the experience and turned back toward the lions. Her upper body was fully above the vehicle profile, her movement clearly visible against the open scrub behind her. What gets me is that Dumi told her twice before she even climbed down. Twice. And she told him she had paid for the experience, as if the lion was going to honor her booking. The dominant male's head turned toward the vehicle, his ears angled back, his body weight shifted forward onto his front legs. Dumi read the posture immediately and told everyone to stay down and not move. Carol looked at the lion, looked at her camera screen, and decided the angle still was not right. She climbed down from the vehicle and stepped onto the ground despite the standing rule, one that had been explained before the drive even began. Dumi's voice changed. Get back in the vehicle, now. She held up one hand toward him and raised her camera. The lion was already moving. The charge covered the distance, with no pause and no warning sound. Carol had no time to turn back toward the vehicle. The lion hit her at full speed and drove her to the ground with his full weight behind the impact. He pinned her and bit down on her neck and upper body, the force of the bite crushing through tissue and bone. The attack lasted only seconds. Doomy activated the emergency beacon and kept the other passengers down inside the vehicle. Response teams used deterrent fire to push the lion back before anyone could approach on foot. Carol Weston was confirmed dead at the scene. Investigators discovered the victim exited the vehicle, triggering immediate predatory lion attack after ignoring guide instructions. She was buried privately with her ex-husband in attendance. Her last social media post had received 34, but she never got to see them.